In 2017, protesters burned American flags outside the Republican National Convention. Police arrested several demonstrators, but charges were later dropped. Why? Because in 1989, the Supreme Court ruled that flag burning constitutes protected speech under the First Amendment. This protection didn't exist for most of American history. Today, we'll examine how landmark Supreme Court cases transformed the First Amendment from a limited government restriction into robust protection for even offensive expression. For over 130 years, First Amendment protections remained surprisingly weak. During World War I, Americans were imprisoned for criticizing the war effort. Early Supreme Court cases like Schenck versus United States in 1919 established tests that often justified restricting speech rather than protecting it. The real transformation began in the mid-20th century, when the court started taking seriously the amendment's role in protecting democratic discourse. 3 cases fundamentally reshaped free speech law and created the robust protections we recognize today. Brandenburg versus Ohio in 1969 established the imminent lawless action standard. Clarence Brandenburg was a Ku Klux Klan leader in Ohio who organized a rally where speakers made inflammatory statements about African Americans and Jews. He was convicted under Ohio's criminal syndicalism law for advocating violence and lawlessness. The Supreme Court overturned his conviction and established a new test that remains the gold standard for speech protection. The court ruled that speech advocating illegal action is protected unless it meets 2 strict criteria. It must be directed to inciting or producing imminent lawless action, and it must be likely to incite or produce such action. This replaced earlier, more restrictive tests with a standard that strongly favors speech protection. Under Brandenburg, the government can only restrict speech when violence or lawbreaking is both intended and immediately likely to occur. The decision didn't protect Brandenburg's message. It protected the principle that even offensive speech deserves constitutional protection unless it poses a clear and immediate danger. New York Times Company versus Sullivan in 1964 focused on protecting criticism of public officials. L.B. Sullivan, a police commissioner in Montgomery, Alabama, sued the New York Times for libel over an advertisement criticizing police treatment of civil rights protesters. The ad contained minor factual errors, and an Alabama court awarded Sullivan $500,000 in damages. The Supreme Court reversed this decision and revolutionized libel law. The court established the actual malice standard, requiring public officials to prove that false statements were made with knowledge of their falsity or with reckless disregard for the truth. Justice William Brennan wrote that the First Amendment requires a federal rule that prohibits a public official from recovering damages for a defamatory falsehood relating to his official conduct unless he proves that the statement was made with actual malice. This decision recognized that robust debate about public officials' conduct is essential to democratic government. The court understood that fear of libel suits could chill legitimate criticism of government, undermining the First Amendment's core purpose of enabling public accountability. The actual malice standard makes it much harder for public figures to win libel cases, ensuring that journalists and citizens can criticize government officials without fear of devastating financial judgments for minor errors. Tinker versus Des Moines in 1969 established student speech rights. In December 1965, John and Mary Beth Tinker, along with Christopher Eckhart, wore black armbands to their Iowa public schools to protest the Vietnam War. School officials suspended them for violating a hastily adopted policy banning armbands. The Supreme Court sided with the students in a landmark decision protecting student speech rights. Justice Abe Fortas wrote that students don't shed their constitutional rights to freedom of speech or expression at the schoolhouse gate. The court established that student speech is protected unless it substantially disrupts the school environment or interferes with the rights of others. Since the armbands caused no disruption beyond some discussion, the suspensions violated the First Amendment. This case extended constitutional protections to America's schools and recognized that young people possess speech rights. The decision emphasized that schools cannot silence student expression simply because administrators disagree with the message. Tinker remains the foundation for student speech rights, though subsequent cases have carved out exceptions for speech that schools can restrict in specific educational contexts. The flag-burning cases established symbolic speech protection. The principle from these cases culminated in Texas versus Johnson in 1989 and United States versus Eichmann in 1990, which protected flag burning as symbolic speech. Gregory Johnson burned an American flag during a political protest at the 1984 Republican National Convention in Dallas. Texas convicted him under a law prohibiting flag desecration. The Supreme Court overturned his conviction, ruling that the First Amendment protects symbolic speech that conveys a political message. Justice William Brennan wrote that the government cannot prohibit expression simply because society finds it offensive or disagreeable. When Congress passed a federal flag protection law in response, the court struck it down in Eichmann, emphasizing that constitutional principles don't change based on public opinion. These precedents shaped contemporary free speech debates involving social media, online harassment, and digital protest. While private platforms can moderate content, government attempts to regulate online speech face the same strict scrutiny established in these landmark cases. The Brandenburg Standard protects controversial online speech unless it incites imminent violence. The Sullivan Standard shields criticism of public officials on social media, and Tinker principles apply when schools attempt to punish students for online expression. These landmark cases transformed the First Amendment from a weak constraint on government into a powerful protection for expression, even when that expression offends mainstream opinion. The court recognized that protecting unpopular speech strengthens democratic discourse for everyone. Which constitutional case should we analyze next? Share your suggestions in the comments, and subscribe for more deep dives into the Supreme Court decisions that shape American law.